Welcome to our webinar on Shifting Gears on Juvenile Justice Communications. We're pleased to have you with us today. My name is Kate Shatskin, and I am a Senior Communications Manager at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you a little about the foundation. The Annie E. Casey Foundation was started by Jim Casey, the founder of UPS, in honor of his mother, Annie, who kept their family together through hard times. And in that spirit, we work today to develop solutions to build a brighter future for kids, families, and communities across the United States. And we want to make sure that public systems are able to keep kids and families whenever possible and equip them to become successful adults. And support their families in helping them do that. And this includes young people who've been in trouble with the law. So we work in the juvenile justice space, and our work there includes the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, or JDAI, a model that now operates in more than 250 communities across the country. So that's why we're very pleased to bring you this webinar today, which features research we have commissioned from the Frameworks Institute on talking about juvenile justice communications, creating long-term frames for that. And I'm pleased to have with us today Julie Sweetland, who is Vice President for Strategy and Innovation at Frameworks. And over the next hour or so, she's going to walk us through some new research, introduce us to a message memo and toolkit that are hot off the presses and that we hope are going to be of great value to you in communicating your work to serve young people. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Julie. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Kate. And as I get started here, I just wanted to also thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation for giving us the opportunity to do this important work and bringing it forward to folks like you who I hope can use it to create and drive change. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the Frameworks Institute. We are an independent nonprofit think tank that investigates the communications aspect of social justice issues. We're a collection of about 20 social scientists from different fields. I happen to be a linguist. We have psychologists, anthropologists, political scientists on staff. And we bring this multidisciplinary approach and the methods from those fields to think through in a very rigorous and reliable way, what does it take to reframe an issue? We work on many different social issues. Here's just a couple examples. We're probably best known for our work on early childhood. It brought forth frame elements like toxic stress, brain architecture, and the argument that you can pay early on to invest in developing children's brains and bodies, or pay more later in the form of increased costs for social services and decreased health outcomes. But we work across the lifespan from early childhood to aging. We work in many different areas of social change, education, criminal justice, immigration reform, climate change, and so forth. We're really excited to get the opportunity to do this type of analysis for juvenile justice, just given the importance of the issue. So when we take on reframing an issue, if I could draw your attention to the center of this diagram, we conduct what we call a strategic frame analysis, where we map public thinking, what's in the culture, what are the patterns of thinking in the public's mind that make the issue difficult to talk about, misunderstood, or get it stuck. How is media framing the issue, and how does that affect public thinking and the space that advocates are working in? How do advocates want to talk about the issue? What do experts say about the issue that are really important concepts to bring to the public? And then we use multiple methods to iteratively develop, test, retest, and refine different ways of explaining the issue in order to really drive changes in public thinking and shift the policy climate. So I'm not going to go through all of those methods today, but I just wanted to let you see at a high level the studies that we took into this analysis of pre-existing work to really tailor a strategy for juvenile justice. So we're pulling on work on education, the justice systems, including the adult system, youth development, child and youth development, and racial disparities. So without further ado, let's see what the landscape is in terms of juvenile justice communication. So the first part of the landscape is that the field is really making a great amount of progress right now. Here's just a half a dozen headlines, that we plucked from the last year or so, illustrating, great progress and important changes at the policy level. But we want to just caution the field that just because you have a window of opportunity doesn't mean that you will get through that window and achieve the bigger transformations you're hoping to push forward. And in fact, the scholarship of social movements has pointed to times when it seemed like the structural conditions were really just right, but the movement ended up stalling. And in those sorts of situations, scholars in that area say that those kinds of unaccounted for plateaus can be explained by the absence of a resonant master frame. And one reason for that is that if a field doesn't have a broad framing strategy, even if discrete parts of that broad field are doing well, if they're not harmonizing their issues, then they're diluting their power. So this schematic just shows just a few different areas within the juvenile justice sector, not to pick on these folks, but just as examples of different aspects of the work. If all these different sectors are putting out different messages about their issue and different messages from each other, then that creates a real kind of chaotic mismatch landscape of messages that the public is exposed to, and that can't have an optimal effect on driving public thinking in a more productive direction. An alternative is for different parts of an issue to really coalesce around a shared core story, share some framing at a high level, and by coordinating that, and then their ultimate effect on public understanding is much more coherent and much stronger. And they can really cultivate demand for better policy and cultivate the kind of support that you need to keep those hard-fought wins in place and keep them less vulnerable from pushback or rollback. So we take that finding of the core story quite seriously because it's so important. The first step in arriving at that core story is to really distill what the field wants to get through. What are the ideas? How does it understand the problem, why it matters, and how to solve it? When we looked at what juvenile justice writ large wanted to communicate, we found this kind of narrative. So this is just an untranslated narrative, by which I mean these are the basic ideas without any kind of communication wash over them, without any thinking too much about how to say it. But these are the big unvarnished ideas that the juvenile justice field seems to be resting its case on. But why does this matter? It's ineffective, the status quo is doing more harm than good, and it's inequitable, particularly when we look at racial disparities. What should juvenile justice be doing? How should it work? How should it be working? Well, it should take into account that youth are still under development. That includes developing the ability to judge risks and consequences, and so that should be taken into account in looking at how to respond to certain behaviors. We want to think about the fact that that it's not just the behaviors, but there are other factors at play in terms of prior experiences, race, culture, and class, poverty. All these sorts of things are really driving court involvement or getting in trouble with the law. That the goal of the system is ultimately rehabilitation and making sure that those young people have the chance to really be productive adults and contributors to our communities. And often that goal is best served not through kind of what we think of as typical justice responses, such as what the public might think of as justice responses in terms of lockup and those sorts of things, but really diversion to appropriate services, whether that's mentoring, probation, other kinds of social services that address issues such as mental health issues or family needs, that those are really the best way to go. Why isn't it working that way right now? Well, first of all, we're asking the justice system to really handle problems it wasn't designed to handle. It's not the right system to address many of those underlying issues that are driving youth involvement with the system. That the field says that there are many fantastic models that are really working in terms of getting kids right in the back on the right track, but they are underfunded, too few and far between, and it's just difficult for people for the adults in the system to move young people into those programs sometimes. And although we know that works, we know what doesn't work too, that locking kids up, everyone agrees that leads to worse outcomes rather than better, no matter kind of which outcome you're picking, whether that's public safety or the outcomes related to the youth and the families themselves. So what should we do about that? Well, we really need to take a prevention approach and an early intervention approach when we have identified young people who are at risk for first-time involvement or increased involvement deeper in the system. We need to think about the targeted supports. What are the rehabilitative and other services that they really need? We need to focus on diversion rehabilitation, and then there are a long list of discrete policies that can address particular challenges in the system, similar to the diagram I showed before. So this is the kind of ideas we see the field is trying to get through and needing to get through. Unfortunately, these issues are difficult. The public thinks about them in quite a different way, and it's difficult for them to see these in a top-of-mind, easy way. So I'm going to show you a bit of data illustrating where the public is, and it's a different place than where the field is, no surprise to you. These are, I'm going to show on-the-street interviews, which are rapid interviews on video that our anthropologists do in locations across the nation. We ask people very open-ended questions like, why do some children turn out well and others end up in trouble? And ask questions about why do we have a criminal justice system, things like that. And we use this method as well as other more long-form interviews to map where the public is on a particular area. I'm going to show this video. It's about 2 minutes long, and then we'll return and talk through what the public narrative is and how that differs from the field's narrative.
Tell me a little bit about what determines how well a child develops.
I have no idea.
Or how well they turn out.
No idea.
Children, so
I would say
this is kind of a hard one for me, actually.
What their parents' expectations are?
parents. The parents.
I'll go with parenting.
It always goes back to the parents because they're a big factor, huge.
The parenting can have a big part of it.
Number one, I would say, is their parents, their environment, their nurture.
It's a lot of your upbringing.
The way we raise our children.
How they were raised.
How their parents raised them.
You need to go into the family and find out maybe what's going on.
By the time a kid's 6, it's pretty locked in to a lot of his ideas and biases and a lot of his developmental, whether he's on par developmentally.
I think it's personal choice. I just think it's the easiest thing that's available to the individual.
Why do we need a criminal justice system at all?
Because some people make wrong decisions.
When it comes to that point, if they're going to make the wrong decision or if they're going to make the right decision.
Because they think they can get away with it, and they don't.
Are there things you would think of that would improve the system?
I'm sure there are, but I don't know if I can think of anything.
For the most part, I think the system is working good.
If people knew like a harsh truth or a harsh type of punishment that would happen if you did this, we would have less crime.
Punishments should be a little bit more harsh.
If your crime's bad enough, I don't think we should just allow people just to get away with that.
I think that there has to be natural consequences to your actions.
I think consequences just help a child learn how to make decisions, to make better decisions.
There's going to be things that kids might do that you still have to hold that over their heads.
They need to know that if they continue that behavior, that there's going to be maybe additional consequences.
There are always inequalities. There's inequalities in humanity. There's going to be constant inequalities in life. The fact that there are inequalities is opportunity.
I think everybody has to go through some adversity. I don't think, all positive is always good.
But it's up to each individual as
in themselves to really dictate where their lives are going to go.
It still takes that individual person to want it for themselves. So that child, although they fostered, if they don't want it, if they can't see it, if they can't grab it for themselves, they're still going to miss it. So you can't grab everybody.
All right, so what did we see there in those interviews? This is the story that the public fills in about juvenile justice. So why does this matter? People think that the juvenile justice system matters, or the criminal justice system more broadly. I appreciate that those of you in the field consider the criminal system and the juvenile system, very different entities, and they are. In the public mind, they're conflated in a lot of ways, and there's not that crisp distinction that those of you who are close to the issue hold. So if we're talking about kind of law and order stuff, then that is seen in the public's mind as we want that to fulfill the function of keeping society safe and ensuring that there's accountability and consequences for those behaviors that get on the wrong side of the law. And that holds true whether we're talking about adults or juveniles, but you saw the public there thinking about young people in those ways of wanting consequences. How does the system work? The public isn't thinking about child development as a piece of how this system should be working. They're really thinking about deterrence and choice, deterrence, and punishment. So most people follow the law, some people don't for different reasons. So we'll get to that. And when they get caught, they go to jail. So it's a pretty clear and simple system. Why isn't it working? Well, first of all, a lot of the public believes the system is working just fine. But if they're thinking about those people who are choosing not to follow the law, then they point the finger at bad parents. We'll say teenagers, they're not talking about impulse control, but really talking about teens as morally defective adults, that they have the capacity to make better choices and are choosing not to because of their immaturity. But in the end, it is about choice. And when it comes around to questions, which we didn't necessarily see on the tape, but we have other data on this, as to why there might be disproportionate involvement of people of color or other populations, it's simply because those people tend to make more bad choices because there's more bad parents, fewer opportunities, those sorts of things. So what can we do about it? In the public's mind, one answer is, well, we don't need to do anything about it because it's working. But if pressed, they're not sure. They think there's not much we can do because in the end, people being in secure lockup is a function of their individual choices. And the main thing that we could do to make the system more effective and to prevent crime is to affect the decision-making calculus by increasing punishments. This is a rational actor kind of model. If individuals are making conscious choices to commit crimes, we want to change their cost-benefit analysis by increasing the punishment. I know that these are probably familiar understandings or misunderstandings to you all. I think it's helpful to think about this as a coherent story that has kind of an internal logic for it, and to think about how we can supplant this kind of narrative with the kinds of understandings that you are going for. And one thing that we can understand about, one thing we can take from this kind of narrative is that resonating with this narrative is potentially not the most effective use of your communications. If we want to meet people where they are, the place where they are is actually not very productive to really pushing reform forward. And so I like to remind or bring forth this quote from our kindred spirits at the Berkeley Media Studies group, that in working on reframing and pushing forward social change, that first and foremost, message is never first or foremost, that the words we use to make our case are important, yet they're not the first consideration. We really want to think about the frames we use in the context of what programs we're trying to move, what policies we're trying to move, and really not giving up on moving the public, starting with where you want to go and plotting the ride along the way. And I say that because it might be tempting to say, well, the public believes in safety and accountability. Let's talk about that and kind of hitch our reform wagon to that. And that sort of thing, once you get into the purpose of this sector of our public policy is to create safety and mete out consequences, then you're in this whole narrative. And so reframing starts in that top box, and we need to fill in something different in each of these boxes to really get to that. So at a high level, the shifts that we see the field needing to make based on our analysis is you want to avoid leaving blanks for the public to fill in because they're filling in, they don't understand child development, and they'll fill in parents making bad decisions, their kids making bad decisions after them. So those are filling in a new narrative is really important. You can do that by telling a whole story that talks about why this matters in a very different way, shows the processes that are at play, explains the problem, and really doesn't just remind people that the system is broken, but convinces them that it can be fixed. And that requires moving away from any kind of language that highlights individual choice and really focusing more on common processes and mechanisms that work across all sorts of categories of behaviors and folks that get involved in the system. We think it's a little dangerous to appeal to fairness full stop as your reason for doing this, because people understand fairness in lots of different ways. As I'm sure you're aware, that sometimes they understand it as doing exactly the same thing to everyone. That's the kind of logic that structures mandatory minimums and uniform sentencing sorts of policies. And sometimes they think of it more contextually, which is helpful in some instances. In others, they think of violence as a big piece of the context, and so therefore go back into a punitive space. So we think that the field should really coalesce around talking about fairness in a particular way in terms of a just response is really going to take age into account. And then go a little further into age by talking about the developing brain. I'll say more about this later, but if we're going to talk about taking age into account, that means not telling a story that's about a child being vulnerable or kind of playing on our sympathies around children. Because Americans think if a child is vulnerable, that's evidence of bad parenting or dysfunctional communities. Whereas if we can make this a story that's about brains, which again is a common process, kind of takes particular individuals or particular groups out of the frame and really makes it a more scientific kind of discussion, then that is a more productive terrain to have this kind of age-appropriate kind of discussion on. Instead of telling a story that is about rebutting what the public thinks and just pointing out and with all kinds of facts and figures and relying on it to say deterrence or confinement doesn't work, it's true they don't work, but it's much more effective, again, rather than convincing people that what we're doing isn't working. Nod to that, establish that, stipulate to that, but really spend much more time saying we have practical, effective alternatives. And in general, because this is seen as a system that's working, and because there's such a strong belief in the rational actor model, where this is about individuals making choices, a sense of this is a crisis, or a sense of this is a complete moral outrage, that kind of language is not likely to move the public, whereas a more pragmatic tone that says this is a problem and we can and should solve it is likely to attract a lot more allies and build a bigger tent, which again is going to protect the wins that you've already made and build those constituencies you need to make the changes that are still ahead. So these are the big shifts. Unfortunately, there is no big light switch that just lets you move from one type of story to the next, but it's more like a sextant where you are, where in framing, you're coordinating different aspects of your message, different aspects of your language, your visuals, your data, your numbers to really point people in the direction of this frame you're trying to advance. And here's just a couple of examples of why you need lots of different choices in your language, or in building a frame. So this is other folks' studies, not ours, but just a couple interesting examples that shows how different frame elements, different choices in your communication can have differential effects. So a study that compared the difference in values, or the part of your message that says why this matters. If you said, given the importance of free speech, would you favor allowing a hate group to hold a political rally? 85% of Americans are in favor of that. But if you say, given the risk of violence, would you favor allowing a hate group to hold a political rally? That number drops to 40%. So the why you say it matters can have a very sizable effect. A metaphor which prompts and primes the public to think about it like this. So the study I thought would be of interest to this particular group. These are not metaphors we're recommending. Both of them are problematic, but I think it can illustrate the point that the metaphor you use to choose about what this is about and how it works can make a big difference. Some researchers at Stanford found that in a study that said crime is like a beast or an animal that's preying on our community, that really strongly drove people to endorse very punitive policies and move away from discussions of rehabilitation or diversion. Whereas saying that crime was more like a virus and infecting our community, that rate was much lower. People were more likely to endorse more reform policies. So just a couple of examples of the pieces of a narrative, the things you fill in, values, metaphors, numbers, which we'll talk about, and the fact that the choices you make about those can have pretty dramatic effects on public understanding. We'll turn to our own research on the way to build a frame in just in the next section here.
So Julie, this has been great so far. I have one question, sort of thinking about the government systems, those who actually run juvenile justice systems. A lot of those folks are likely to be listening to this presentation. And I'm just wondering, it seems that the advanced language you put forward would work really well in terms of sort of suggesting how within a system you can make change and why you would want to do that. But I'm wondering at the same time how you can also frame progress you're making, the fact that the status, if you're in a reform position, what you're doing that's right, at the same time you can try to also talk about what you need to do that's better, if you can help people walk that line a little bit.
Yeah, I think that this is a kind of strategy that allows both for folks outside the system to push assertively yet productively with their colleagues in the system, push for real change, and lets folks in the system tell a much more productive narrative themselves. So it is a strategy that should work for both folks running the system and folks trying to push it forward from the outside. I think that the frames that those two sets of change makers can use are very similar within this strategy. This allows for solution stories. So we're doing this because we want to take a common sense approach to making sure that what we in government are doing is working. We're really taking child development into account and really thinking about the young people that we're interacting with and how we can make sure that we're getting them back on the right track and returning them to our communities to contribute. We've done these practical, effective things. We still have some problems, and this is what we're looking for to solving it. So I think you can use that same kinds of moves you need to make if you're in the system. Does that, I don't know, how's that land? Does that make sense to you?
No, that's great. I think that'll be really helpful. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So we've talked a little bit about where the landscape is. We've talked about the big shifts we want to make, or that we're recommending that the field make, and then we'll talk about some very specific communications tools, some themes and some values and some metaphors and some organizational things that help make that real and actionable. When we start to test potential reframing strategies, I like to think about what we're trying to accomplish by thinking about the back of a speaker panel. So you have here an input and an output port, and think about the language, the cues that you're using to help the public think about a topic, or the things you're using in your communications as the input. And what you want is a certain set of knowledge, attitudes, dispositions, and policy preferences as a result of that communication. So what the public takes away from it and where they get to is the output. And I just want to caution you that the two things are not the same. These are two separate ports. And we at Frameworks think you should start from what you're trying to accomplish in terms of those attitudes and policy preferences and work backwards to the communication cue or the input that you're using. So as an example of that, what are the outputs? So when we say when a frame works, what are we trying to do? We've tested these things against policies like these: a developmentally appropriate juvenile justice approach. How much does the public support something like eliminating life without the possibility of parole for juveniles? We want to ensure, we looked at the effects of these frames on reducing the disproportionate impact of the system on people of color, for instance, policies around racial impact analyses of any kind of legislation. And we also looked at people's understanding of the causes of crime, because we've seen in both in social science more broadly and our own research that people's understandings of the cause of a problem have a real significant effect on their understandings of appropriate solutions. So these are the things we want our communications to do. How would we know if people got more supportive of these? We've developed an experimental design over time where we start with a large online nationally representative sample. We randomly assign people to different message conditions or treatment groups. So one person logs on and gets frame A, one person logs on and gets a little message about frame B, another C, other control group. Because we've got a large sample randomly assigned and minimally differing messages, we can feel confident that if we're seeing differences in people's attitudes, knowledge, and policy support, it's about the frame they got, it's about the treatment. It's not about what they thought or who they were when they got there. Through that method, the narrative that we're recommending, this is a high-level schematic. This is not words, this is not a script to walk out and start saying, but these are the themes and ideas we think need to fill in those four narrative boxes that we've been working with in order to really shift public thinking into a policy climate. So why does this matter? It's a practical, common sense problem that we need to have a juvenile justice system that meets our goals for public safety and rehabilitation. And the system we have right now, we can see that it's not working well because of racial disparities. This is evidence that we're not really taking an objective and level-headed look at how to run things. How does this work and why isn't it working? One thread of this narrative is a developmental narrative. So how does this work? Brains are building from the bottom up, and that construction process goes on for a long time. Adolescents are still forming their capacities to judge risks and consequences. Executive function is like the air traffic control of the brain that helps people manage all sorts of incoming problems and challenges, and that part is still developing well into the early 20s. That if the air traffic control kind of isn't fully developed, or if I'm down in box 3 here, the mental health isn't as level as it should be, then we're likely to see more issues with youth behavior that can lead to criminal justice involvement or involvement in the juvenile justice system. So that's kind of the developmental narrative. You could also go through this as what's up with the system narrative. So that's our bottom items. In box 2, the system is like a complicated maze with too many entrances in, not enough entrances out, too many young folks are getting caught in this system and moving deeper and deeper into the system instead of being rehabilitated and returned to their communities. And it's not working because we're not using all the gears available to us. We've got a lot of gears on the bike of juvenile justice. Most of them should be diversion gears. We're overusing the lockup gears, and there's more ways you can play with that metaphor. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So kind of 2 is choose your own adventure through this narrative. And then what can we do about it? Well, we can think about what we need to do for youth and communities as a lot like a scale. That we can tip, a balance pan scale. We can stack more positive experiences and interventions and supports on the scales where there are a lot of weights in those communities or on those children's lives, things like abuse, neglect, or poverty. involvement in the foster system, whatever those kind of negative risk factors are. We really want to overcompensate, counterbalance that scale in places where there are a lot of weights on the negative side. So that's one way of thinking about more holistic solutions. And you can also end this story with very specific policy prescriptions. So you could say, we can see from brain architecture that we haven't formed that capacity to judge risks and consequences until much later. This is leading to way too many people in the system, and then you can talk about the need to raise the age. So that could be a solution, kind of policy solution, or where that's worked well at the end. So filling in those boxes with something from those frame elements is the kind of different strategies we're hoping to advance and offer to you all. Let me show you some of the evidence behind these, starting with the pragmatism. So when we ran an experiment similar to the one I described before, we tested 4 values, 4 reasons for saying why this matters and why this needs to come to the public attention. We tested fairness, prevention, cost efficiency, and pragmatism. We can see that pragmatism, you can see the blue bar there going in a negative direction and a statistically significant sort of way that moves people in the wrong direction when it comes to disparities. Our interpretation is that people will pay, they're not so much worried about cost if it's about locking those bad people up. So they're willing to pay for that. It's not a compelling argument. We see that fairness, that there are no statistically significant results there. It's the same as saying nothing on this issue. Doesn't mean we can't work towards a more just system. It means that opening up your story as this is about being more fair is not it's just not an effective prime on this matter. Prevention is very helpful in terms of helping people understanding the causes of crime, but wasn't effective in helping people think about the juvenile system or racial disparities more effectively. And because each of those other 3 that we tested were not effective, and we took these from the field and arguments the fields were making, we have a pretty clear recommendation that using the value of pragmatism in that opening box is the most reliable way of starting the case. I'm going to add one more piece of data to this, and then we'll look at that recommendation a little more closely. So with a similar experiment, we added a couple different frame elements. Because remember, we're adjusting that sextant. We're adding these things together. So in the center of this graph, you can see the pragmatism results that I just showed you. They get good movement on juvenile justice and good movement on causes of crime. If we just said, we just pointed out racial disparities data, that was the same as saying nothing. It wasn't, didn't do much harm, didn't do much good. But if we took pragmatism and added a racial disparities message to that, then we got a bigger effect on the causes of crime, the same level of effect on juvenile justice, and a bigger, although not yet significant, type of movement on disparities. So we think that adding these 2 things together is important. And the reason, one interpretation of that is it's really important to give people a lens through which to view the issue of race, and one that lots of people can see this as a conversation that they can be included in and aligned with. And so saying that, hey, we need a system that works, and right now we can see that this is not working for all of our communities, really can engage a much broader swath of Americans in that equity conversation than one that starts the conversation in a little further down that narrative. We've got the Swiss Army knife here is our symbolism here of that we can get this done. Again, our job is not to convince people that the system is broken, but rather that it can be better. And so by, the kind of theme here is to take a practical, common sense approach to solving problems in the system and in our communities to do very practical things like decrease crime, make more responsible use of our resources. So this kind of frame element, we saw moving people away from a sense of fatalism or a sense of complacency, saying that the system works just fine. It included lots of groups in it, that it doesn't make this just a problem for the people who are trapped in the system, but rather a problem that affects us all. It's got shared fates and shared consequences in it. The way you might use this at a practical level is here. So I have here on the gray side of the screen, a communication taken from advocates in the field that talks about an interactive map and related data about youth detention across the country and points out the difference, in lockup rates. Yet 75% are detained for non-violent offenses. How does your state fare? I'll give you a clue. Your state arrests and detains youth of color at a greater rate than it does white kids, and not because white kids are committing fewer offenses. The disparity exists across the nation. We can ignore the facts, or we can do our part to keep the facts up and front and center in our conversations and decisions. So this communications expects that fact to speak for itself. We have lots of evidence that shows, not just from this project, but many, that data don't speak for themselves, that if the facts don't fit the frame stays and the facts go. And then in fact, without a lot of cues to the public that they should interpret racial disparity data as evidence of a structural problem, if you just kind of throw it out there naked like that, people will interpret it as evidence of greater rates of crime or other moral deficiency in that community. So this communication makes a fine point, but is doing it in a way that's likely to lead to an interpretation that the communicators don't intend. So to reframe it, using this strategy of leading with pragmatism and bringing in racial impact facts as a strong source of evidence of why the system isn't working as well as it could, it might look like this. So to make sure that our justice system is serving its purpose of public safety and rehabilitation, we need to keep an eye on data that give us an objective sense of how things are working. Data right now suggests that our current system is treating some communities more harshly than others. Although youth of color don't commit more offenses, they're more likely to be detained than white kids. In fact, that's 4.6 rate. And of all youth, around 75% are detained for minor offenses. And I chose the word minor instead of nonviolent because reminding public of the distinction between violent and nonviolent ultimately makes it more difficult to get good reforms in the case of violent offenses. So we recommend talking about minor offenses rather than nonviolent offenses. These disparities exist in every state and every community. Instead of moralizing and really kind of calling people out in a potentially uncomfortable way to either ignore it or lean forward, it is going to attract a broader tent of allies to say we need to take a practical, methodical approach to taking this, to changing this. So that's the way we might tackle that. On to the next box, and I'll go through the developmental kind of path this narrative just for a little bit, talking about how it works and maybe why isn't it working, just talking a little bit about how to bring youth development into your narrative and how to take advantage of the frames that are being used in neighboring fields on child and youth development. So the juvenile justice sector can benefit from reframing strategies that are in use by other sectors of the broader children's advocacy field. So these metaphors and strategies from the core story of early development is something we've developed over time, over the past 10 to 15 years in partnership with the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child and others. Concepts like brain architecture, the brain being built from the bottom up in an orderly, predictable fashion. This is a construction project that takes a long time. And air traffic control, that the ability to manage impulses, manage incoming stimuli, all those sorts of things are a lot like an air traffic control system for the brain. These metaphors have a lot of miles on them. They've been road tested nationally at different levels of social change with people within the system and advocates working outside the system. And so the juvenile justice system can really pull on this way of talking about child development to expand it, be good neighbors to folks working on, outside the juvenile system, but in youth development more broadly, but also just kind of take advantage of the fact that these terms are in use and take advantage of that shared language. So here's how it might be applied to a juvenile justice system such as solitary confinement for youth. So again, this is something taken from the field on the gray side. But probation camps and juvenile halls where delinquent minors are often held, officials sometimes have no choice but to temporarily isolate disruptive juveniles for the safety of other youth and camp personnel. But as an hour turns into a day or more, and reports suggest it can turn into a week or a month, temporary isolation turns solitary confinement, a brutal practice when employed against anyone, and an especially cruel way to treat a juvenile who is still developing and doesn't have the skills to bounce back. Juvenile justice officials should at the very least have to certify that mental health evaluations are part of the decision-making process. With or without funding, California must closely watch and regulate solitary confinement of juveniles. So in this framing, there's some language here that's unlikely to be moving, such as brutal practice and cruel ways. That's the kind of language that would resonate with those who are already aligned with the issue. But it isn't, it's using strong word choice to try to align people with the issue, where rather than going for an emotional appeal, an explanatory framing would be much more effective, our research shows. So why is it that it's brutal or cruel? Why is it that it's an kind of an inappropriate kind of strategy for people in this developmental stage? So in using a developmental argument and on this kind of issue, this is the way we would, just a way to model applying this strategy. So at probation camps and juvenile halls holding youth, officials sometimes temporarily isolate children or adolescents for their safety and others. So I've done a couple things there. I haven't talked about them as delinquent minors. I haven't kind of lifted up the specter of an unruly or disruptive or dangerous young person in order, by using the word disruptive juvenile to kind of, give an opening as to why this might be a necessary practice. I just simply said it happens. But too often it goes on for a long period of time. This is especially harmful to young people. Now I need to say why. Whose brains are still developing. Let's give the public some new information about that. Adolescence is a period of intensive construction for brains when the architecture is still being built. Traumatic experiences such as solitary confinement can have lifelong consequences for brain functioning, and that's counterproductive to helping these youth re-enter their community successfully. So that's pulling in this kind of pragmatic sort of idea that we've got this goal, let's make sure what we're doing meets that goal. Juvenile justice officials should make mental health evaluations a part of the decision-making process in every case, and California must consider building healthy brains in the rehabilitation process. So again, keeping it within this rehabilitation goal and really bringing in more and new information, basing this based on, into the case, basing it on science as opposed to vulnerable child, which this other one is kind of leaning more on that kind of argument. So I hope that makes sense. That's one way is to kind of take a developmental path. There are times where that doesn't seem suitable, or your point that you're making is really not about the age and the age appropriateness of a specific practice, but rather about the system itself. So we have two metaphors that can help talk about the systems in such a way that redirects attention away from the individuals and what they did to get themselves into the system, and rather really place the onus on the system itself, and let's scrutinize that and think about how we can change that as opposed to the decisions of individuals. So there's two metaphors. One is gears, which you can read the short version of it there, really saying that this is a metaphor that helps us think about the many different approaches we can have to an underlying situation, and let's think about choosing the best one. So this is more of a we have alternative solutions available type of metaphor. And then the Justice Mays metaphor, which is designed to point attention to how the system is not working and the fact that it's not effective. So where you have the instinct to say the system is broken, this is probably the metaphor that you want to reach for. And it's important to choose a metaphor that's not about the system being broken, but rather it's about a structure that could be intervened in. And a maze of the ones we tested was most effective there. So here's an example of how to use gears and talk about that a little bit. So I'll let you just give me a moment to read the gray side of this message. This is taken from the field, and we'll talk about the framing choices I see in it and how we might reframe it for more powerful effect. All right, so what I see here is encapsulated in the title there. There's a big problem. We have large number of folks getting in, young people coming into this system. Minor offenses, nonviolent offenses. There's not any way to really treat them, so they are getting enmeshed in the system. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences of how bad this is. And then at the bottom, some people are looking at the other things we could do, right? So that doesn't feel well matched. It doesn't have a real firm, concrete example of what we could do, and it doesn't offer any mechanism that the public can start to think about as possibly more productive. So this one is maybe convince us that the system is broken, but again, we want to show people that we have a system that could be better in order to engage their sense of can-do and wanting to really do something and care about their role as a citizen. This leaves the public with a sense that there isn't a lot that can be done, and they're likely to turn away in a fatalistic attitude or an apathetic attitude with that kind of framing. So it's not that the analysis there is on point. It's a true and well-written and clear communication. How can we use what we know about public thinking, and how can we use this tested alternative to get people to think differently? Well, start off by saying our juvenile justice system is a lot like a bike. When we apply the right gear for the terrain, or you could say, the road we're on, the system works well to prevent problems and rehabilitate youth who's gotten in trouble. Right now, we're underutilizing the ability to shift gears. We've got some situations that call for guidance and support, others call for mental health treatment, still others for mentoring. But right now, we're filing cases and even locking up thousands of young people instead of switching to these diversion gears. A common sense alternative is to make sure that communities have the programs and the support networks to address young people's specific needs. And let's give a more positive sense of what's the possibility. Communities that have shifted gears have found they're moving more kids in the right direction. So this has more of a sense of possibility, give some concrete examples of what the kinds of things we're talking about as appropriate community-based treatments and services. Lets people imagine, mental health treatment, mentoring, just a general support network. And so that is more likely to engage the public in a productive way of thinking about this. Let me show right now a video that shows that when people are exposed to a message like this, how the public thinks about these things. This is from our method called persistence trials, in which our researchers teach the metaphor to a pair of people and leave the room. That pair of ordinary folks teaches it to another set of people. They leave. Generation 2 teaches it to Generation 3. Then our researchers come back. We want to see if the metaphor goes goes funky at any point, if people start having, very unproductive conversations. But we're also experimentally modeling how the metaphor works once it leaves your website or your legislative testimony, and kind of people take it and hear it. We want to make sure it's repeatable. We want to make sure that it doesn't kind of break down, as people are repeating it out in society. So let's take a look at people, the public, thinking and talking with justice gears.
How can we improve the criminal justice system in this country?
It's called justice gears.
The idea behind it is to think of the criminal justice system or the rehabilitation path in the criminal justice system as a bicycle.
Just like with the bike, we think that maybe there could be different gears, so to speak, used in the criminal justice system.
There seems to be two different types of justice in terms of who you are, what you look like, whether or not you've had the money.
We have 10 gears that we could use, but we're really only using 1 or 2 of them.
For white people are using all their gears. African Americans, 1 gear.
If that's the case, then we have a problem.
Are we treating children as adults?
Solely relying on incarceration.
A changing of a gear could be, just a different avenue.
Juvenile justice programs.
Some type of rehab program.
Alcohol treatment.
A treatment.
Drug treatment.
House arrest where he's home on the weekend.
Probation.
Counseling. Potential other gears on the bike.
Because I think it's costing society a lot to have all these people in jail.
When you could actually educate that person at a college for that same amount of money.
If you made the terrain easier, you would account for a lot more mitigating circumstances.
There's other possibilities.
How can we avoid a person being stuck in 1 gear?
Could we be better served
to rehabilitate?
Use those gears in order to rehabilitate them for good.
All right. So what our researchers saw in watching that video, and what I hope you heard, is people really thinking very generatively and productively about ways we could change the system, how we could expand and make greater use of alternatives to detention or confinement. Really understanding that the goal was to rehabilitate. We needed to think about that at every step of the way. Able to talk about disparities in a way, and folks within community having a very powerful way to kind of explain how the African American community is not having sufficient access to other gears of the justice system, but really are being detained at much higher rates. So there's a lot there that really engages people's sense of can-do and sense of possibility without trying to act as if there isn't a problem in the system right now. So the other metaphor that we're recommending to talk about the system is justice maze. That the system is like a maze where people are getting into it and not being able to get out. So we've got here an example of how you might apply this to the issue of status offenses. So again, this is an example on the left side taken from the field and describing, really defining status offenses that are illegal based solely on the age of the offender. They're low level, not usually handled in court, but sometimes they are, but sometimes they're detained even though they don't pose a threat. There's lots of these happening, lots of detained and committed juveniles, 2,000 of them on any given day. Half of them are white, a third of them are black. And then their most serious offense was a status offense. So this is just describing the fact of what, defining status offenses and the fact that young people are being detained or committed for them. So we need a little more explanation. People need to see moving parts so they can understand how to adjust them, which this communication doesn't have enough for the public to really see what an appropriate policy response to this problem would be. So with a little more explanation, people can start to think about what they might do differently. So let's establish, a core principle. We need to make sure that when youth get in trouble with the law, the situation doesn't draw them into a maze of increasing legal penalties and problems. There's one entrance to this maze that we need to block off, and that's status offenses. These are behaviors that are illegal only because of the age of the person. They include things like curfew violations or truancy. We think it's important to give some examples of status offenses. People might be familiar with the term, for instance, statutory rape, and we wouldn't want the whole category to really be associated with that one, pretty serious type of age-based offense. And so we think giving some of these examples that are easier to understand and more productively associated with young people are helpful. So to go back to the example, because status offenses don't pose a threat to others, they should never lead to secure detention, which is harmful to a young person's mental health and long-term opportunities. Alternatives exist to hold youth accountable that provide them with additional supervision, guidance, or support if needed. So this is, again, using the idea of maze to say we really shouldn't be pushing people into a system that can make matters worse and is hard to get out of. Giving an example of young behavior that is fairly minor, talking about why that's a problem, and really talking about alternatives. I think this communication would be even stronger if a more specific alternative, with more time, you could go through that. If you could talk about why why the racial disparity is working in a particular way, then I would continue to include race in there, but it wasn't clear for me from the original what that explanation would be. So that's why I took it out, not necessarily because that we're recommending to avoid race. We are recommending the opposite, talk about race early and often, just not without a lot of cues around it to cue structural interpretations of that. So when exposed to this type of message, let's see how people think and talk differently when they hear about the justice maze and the way they think about the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system. And I'd like you to contrast it in your mind with the default thinking that we saw at the top, with people not really thinking that there was much to do to change the system except to increase punishment.
The justice maze. Right now, our justice system is like a maze.
A good analogy is looking at it like a maze.
Let's say someone commits a crime. So once they go in, this is where our maze starts.
Someone is arrested, they get put into the system.
What the system is very systematic.
That's the maze part. They never can get out of it.
So it doesn't care what your circumstances are and what kind of life experiences you've had. They're going to treat everybody the same.
But the criminal justice system we have right now doesn't offer paths out of the maze.
It's like once you're in, you don't really ever, there is no exit at the end of the maze.
Once you get caught in the maze, though, you pretty much only lead to prison.
They can't get a job, or they get fail, especially if they have a felony.
Once you get labeled as a criminal, there's your job opportunity is gone.
Instead, there need to be other routes available, like mental health services, addiction services, or juvenile justice services.
There's people in their prison system that probably could have been rehabilitated or some kind of service.
So I think it needs to be started at an even earlier phase instead of waiting till there's criminals.
Of course, children grow up to be adults.
When you were 18 or 19, you did something this, and then now you're 30.
Yeah.
You shouldn't still have to be paying for that crime. You should be able to have some opportunity to kind of get past that.
We need to change the criminal justice system so that it offers multiple paths so that people can get to where they need to go and then get back out again. So if the system is more of a maze for some than for others, what do we do about that?
We have to fix that first.
System. It looks like you need to find the root cause.
And find out what the underlying cause of that is and deal with it.
Our role or our job is to put them all out into society to be productive citizens.
Okay. What our researchers heard in these conversations is a real ability to hold two ideas in mind. The system we have isn't working well, and there are things we can do to fix it, and those things are very different than increasing punishments, right? That they are about changes to the system, not changes to, not getting tougher on crime. So that is a very significant framing accomplishment. That doesn't mean that maze is the metaphor, right, to talk about every single problem you have, but rather when your communications task is really to show how the system is doing more harm than good, this is a type of metaphor. This metaphor can really help you do that work in a productive way that doesn't undermine your colleagues, in the system, that doesn't undermine overall faith in public systems. It really keeps it in a more we can fix this, and there are some feasible alternatives that can be done, again, without letting the system off the hook. So that is most of the strategy. Those of you who have been quite attentive will remember that there is the bottom box here about talking about what we can do to make sure we're building resilience and really targeting support to young people who are significantly at risk. And we can talk about more policies, closing on things that we can do about it we think are really important, whether that's, again, adding more resources to youth who have a lot of negative weight stacked on their lives or their communities, or talking about clear, concrete policies that have worked, programs that are showing a lot of promise, but really closing on what we can do about it is important. I'm not going to go into resilience scale here because I have a feeling there's only so many metaphors a human being can take in a day, but I do want to point you to the message memo for some illustrations of how that might work on this issue. I'm just going to turn now to talking a little bit about that message memo and some what you can expect to find in the toolkit and some closing thoughts. But I wanted to see, Kate, if you had any questions at this point.
Yes, I do have a couple. One is about the metaphors and whether, those two clearly are resonating with people, but if there are others that, a communicator thinks are really apt in the moment or for a particular audience, are those okay too? Maybe just not quite as good, but if they sound good, how would that work? What would you say about that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and probably I said I wouldn't talk a little about methods, wouldn't talk a lot about methods, but I think I should touch on it a little bit to address that issue. So when we test a metaphor, develop and test a metaphor, we're testing half a dozen or more candidates, and often those are metaphors that are taken from the field. So among the ones we tested, for example, was the idea of justice tools, a toolkit. And it was okay, but it wasn't as strong as gears in really getting people to think about lots and lots of different options and the fact that most of them should be rehabilitative, not punitive. With the toolkit, we saw a little bit more of people thinking, well, punishment is a thing for some things and rehabilitation is a thing for other things, and it wasn't kind of as expansive. It was more set people towards tailoring and customizing the response. But with punishment still kind of an important element of that toolkit. We also, so anyway, we tested lots of metaphors. Most of the ones, that we saw were not as effective as these. In general, we caution against making up your own metaphor simply because in our own, practice of developing and testing dozens, maybe even hundreds of them in a year, most of them don't work very well. They have unanticipated and unpredictable consequences on people's thinking. So we see that as kind of a risk. I think these are metaphors for something, right? They are translating a specific concept, and you can see more about that in the toolkit, what they're designed to do. But if the metaphor just doesn't seem like it is working for your issue, our recommendation would be just explain it with a lot of cause and effect language, a lot of because, then, so, ways people can understand how it's working. Explain it. Don't try to use an analogy because you're really taking a risk in ways people might think about it in a really unproductive way. So that's our main caution is it's a little risky to use a metaphor without testing it first. Does that answer your question?
No, that's good to know. And then I was also just wondering about youth voice, as I heard you talking about earlier about vulnerable children and how we need to stay away from that sort of emotional appeal, and yet we know that policymakers really pay attention when young people talk about their experiences in systems. How can a communicator navigate those tensions and effectively put a young person forward using frames?
Yeah, so that's a question about a frame element, a piece of our sextant that we didn't build into this project. It's a question about messenger. And youth as messengers is a powerful strategy. it's a powerful piece of a strategy, I should say, and it would seem to me to be really important to coordinate that piece of your strategy with this framing strategy, and to do what you can to ensure that the youth are not telling a vulnerable child story, that they're not telling a transformation story, right, a redemption tale so much, where once they made bad choices and then this got them to make better choices. I think it's really important to really bring the young people into a strategy like this one that equip them to tell this kind of more explanatory, systems-based narrative. If the resources don't exist to get them using the metaphors, then at least working with the youth to the point where they can stay out of the avoid side of the strategy and really talk about the practical, effective alternatives that let them really get back on the right track and contribute, and how broaden out to the processes, the underlying things about that program that would apply to all youth and should be available to more youth. I think that would be a way to incorporate the need and desire for youth voice into the recommendations we're giving here.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thanks.
So I'm going to just, so that's youth voice is other equipment for your reframing kit, not something we're contributing to right now, but we hope that this can be of use for all your messengers and different forms of communication. So the toolkit we have is not a turnkey toolkit where you can hit print and you've got messages that are ready to hand out and take to your different meetings, or really just read it off the page and you're ready for your next interview. It's a little more of a capacity building toolkit that lets you think about how these frames work and see how they might be applied in order to build your ability to think about these frame elements and strategies in such a way that lets you apply them to lots of communication. So it's more of an instructional toolkit than what you might be accustomed to seeing in terms of communications toolkit that has, say, an infographic and a one-pager, and it's print and go. It's more turnkey. What we have here are high-level talking points that we would assume you would tailor to your specific situation at hand, your specific audience, your specific policy, or you're talking about that day, or the context. We have message cards that go through the various frame elements in this strategy and really walk through the kinds of things you could say with these, what they're accomplishing, and how they work. Some sample, some questions that you're likely to get in the field. We worked with people in the field to come up with this list of questions, model how people are typically responding to it, and how that kind of same point could be made within this framing strategy. And then a couple sample communications. I think it's a blog post and some tweets that really show how you do pragmatism in 140 characters, right? How can you talk about, hey, we've got this new initiative, in really, using the gears metaphor. And this is an instructional toolkit, not a turnkey toolkit, so that lots of folks across the field can adopt it and adapt this language in a way that works for them, and again can be tailored and customized to your own communications context. We really are hopeful that this language and this kind of understanding of what not to say, what's better to say, and why can be deeply embedded in kind of your overall thinking about communications, and that it's an important part of the strategy that this language become ubiquitous and widely shared. These frames become ubiquitous and widely shared as themes, right? Not necessarily as a script, but as a broad repertoire of themes and ways of talking about the issue that are really productive, and you can have confidence are moving people towards the kinds of reforms you ultimately want to see. And that kind of taking advantage of the power of many voices is really important for such a contested issue and such a racialized issue as the one you all are working on. I have this quote from a very respected voice and kind of Bible in the public health field, but I think it's highly applicable to what juvenile justice is up against. That the advocate's message tends to be complicated rather than simple, longer rather than shorter, and contrary to rather than consistent with popular understanding. So that's what you're up against. For the most part, this means that we have to explain, whereas our opponents just have to state. We need to change people's minds. They just need to reinforce what people already think. We need to emphasize shared responsibility. They just need to highlight personal choice. So a couple of things from that. If it feels like talking about these issues is hard and pushing for the kind of system our children and our nation needs and deserves is hard, it's because it is. You're doing something countercultural, which is difficult, and it's cultural change work. That work can be easier with, again, by joining forces, aligning around shared frames, and really staying out of the frames of the side that are the understandings that attribute all of this, again, to individual choice and willpower and good decision making. So I hope that we have offered some tools that can help you talk systems, help you build the broader community of people who understand this issue and are willing to support it and protect the wins you've already made. We're very eager to interact with the community and juvenile justice advocates and be helpful in understanding this work and applying it in any way that we can. So thank you for your time and attention. Look forward to working in this field more in person and less virtually in the days, weeks, and months ahead. And I want to thank you, Kate, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation for giving us an opportunity to do this work and talk about it with advocates.
Well, thank you, Julie. We certainly appreciated having you with us today. I wanted to close by thanking everybody who is watching, and also to invite you to stay connected with our resources on aecf.org. We have a number of resources for juvenile justice work, including practice guides and other tools. This webinar will continue to be available on our blog, and you can also get our juvenile justice news right in your inbox at aecf.org/newsletters. If you sign up, you won't miss any of our new resources, including great research like what we heard about today. So I want to thank you again, and I'll close the webinar and wish everyone a good afternoon and hope to see you soon.